Hello everyone, welcome back to this channel. This is the first episode that I'm going to be doing off script. I decided this for the channel just because I really don't feel like making videos and, I want to learn history, I want to talk about history, but I really don't want to spend time doing videos. And I get people like to make videos, I get that's people's thing, that's people's niche, making presentations, making them look nice, and that's kind of fun sometimes, but I really don't want to get involved that much with that process. So, from now on, I'm going to do non-scripted. I'm going to just have notes. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. If you want something more professional, you'll have to go somewhere else. If you want something informal, more of an audio listening type of thing, then you're in luck because that's what I want to do. So let's get into the Poor of Lyon again, the episode 2, to get a bit further. Because the last video was kind of long, so I wanted to end it. And I'm probably going to have about 4 videos in this series. We'll see what happens. So, Poor of Lyon. And they were in 1229. The Cathars were defeated, which meant that now the Poor of Lyon were the spotlight of the church and of the secular powers, uh, aims, because the Cathars were a lot bigger of a concern, right? Even modernistic beliefs, modernism, beliefs. I'll get into this in another video if I do anything about the Cathars. I'll talk about them too, and I'll talk about them as it relates to modern people. There's a lot of relations, and a lot of heretics today are Gnostics. I don't really mean Protestants. I mean more like liberals, but um, that's besides the point. It's for another day. But the point is that Gnosticism is something that's been felt for ages and is really big, always been really big, and the church back then even used the Poor of Lyon to fight against the Cathars. So you can see how that went. Now that the Cathars are gone, they're kind of subdued. The church has somewhere else to. They had this giant apparatus of inquisition, of looking around, of trying people, and were they going to just throw that all away? No, they're going to use that for the Poor of Lyon. So they did. And I believe it was in 1231 that as Odiseo writes, a special jurisdiction exercised by delegates of the Pope for the repression of heresy. That's the Inquisition, and that's what was used, and that is actually our greatest source, our greatest wealth of medieval knowledge on Port of Lyon and other heretics as well, because with these inquisitorial notes, books, we have not only the proceedings of the trials of what everybody said, what was believed that the heretics believed, what the heretics actually did believe, but we also have guides that these people made from this time all the way to the Reformation and even beyond, of guidebooks of heresy, where they would explain. They didn't get everything right. The people who were the inquisitors, they didn't actually understand the heresies so well. They did to an extent, but they weren't exactly. They were either trying to bastardize it a bit just to make it look bad, which is possible, or they just genuinely didn't understand it. Because don't forget, these are completely different worlds they're coming from. You have people who are coming from folk backgrounds who still had paganistic elements to their culture, to their lives. Um, and that's not to say that like, oh, the whole church is pagan. Like a lot of people do that nowadays. I think it's stupid, but there were pagan rituals, things they aren't even necessarily evil. They're just kind of there. And it went away with time. Obviously, in the early Middle Ages, you had people who like worshipped the sun, thinking it was God after they came out of church. That's not right, really. Obviously, the sun isn't God. Um, and but that I mean the sun, like the solar sun, obviously. Um, yeah. So and then they had the inquisitors who were probably grown up, they were educated in all this stuff. They were scriptural masters. They knew way more about uh, ritual and how the church worked, theology. They were educated, much more refined people. So when you have them trying to grasp at something that's just so alien to them, I mean, especially if they were abbots and things, like these abbots were just living in monasteries. Their whole goal was to be that stopped a little bit, and I could talk about that another day, talking about monastics being in the world versus out of the world. But a lot of the ones who were out of the world and lived there for so long, and then they had some heretic plopped in front of them. That's not exactly how it went, but to dumb things down a bit, sure, that's how it happened. There'd be a bit of a difficult grasping of the situation on the Inquisitor's part, and the same thing on the Inquisited part, because the people who were being questioned sometimes would actually say heretical things without ever actually being Poor of Lyon or any other heretic. Sometimes they would just be there. They would be talked to, and they would just say what they believed, and they'd have big problems because, hey, you believe heresy. Sometimes they would just accept this and they would just move on. I mean, I'd love to show some examples. There were some in the book of Gabriel Audicio, which is the greatest source for this topic. I'm sure there's inquisitorial things all over the place online and in libraries you could find, but that's the whole point. The Inquisition worked pretty well, and it is our best source. But there were still problems, and it wasn't exactly accurate on either person's part in the Inquisition. So the movement, funny enough, it kept on spreading for a while, even though the goal wasn't really to spread it anymore. Especially, so you have, obviously there was, you had about 1180 to 1230, about 50 years, an entire two generations, say, of being able to spread this new sect all around Europe. After that, the Inquisition would have started in places that was already set up, like in Occitania, Toulouse, Lombardy. Then it had chances to spread as well beyond 1230, and it still could have, depending on the laxity or the controllingness of the lay authorities of the church, if the church wanted to warn Rome or anything. So the whole movement itself spread into the Rhineland really early on, but it also went even into Bavaria and Austria and Bohemia, Moravia as well. There were, as Odysseus writes or cites another source, one of the Austrian inquisitors said that there were 80,000 heretics in Austria, but in Bohemia and Moravia the numbers are infinite. So there was obviously a huge amount of them over there, and it's even pretty evident from the sources and from when you read about them, you'll usually find that they didn't really exist that long, much longer in France. They were still in the Dauphiné for the whole time. They were still in Provence, which eventually was annexed by France in the Reformation. When they were, that's a bit different. We'll get there in a couple episodes. But they really thrived in the East. They were really big there. And so whenever you see all these videos on YouTube and they're like, oh, the Alps, like I mentioned before earlier, oh, they're all in the Alps. So they weren't only in the Alps, they were also everywhere. And they weren't just in the mountains, they were in the villages, they kind of avoided the cities after a time. They tended to avoid the cities for obvious reasons, but they were still in towns. There were some towns that were majority Waldensian. They were still there. They just kind of put on a guise of Catholic and pretended to be Catholic. And that's another bit of massive dissonance that they had as well, and that'll have an impact on the Reformation when we get there. I can talk about that then. They they were they were being Catholic externally. They had double lives. So well, then the Port of Lyon, wherever they went, basically had double lives after their condemnation. They were preaching secretly, but they were going to mass. They were taking the body and blood of Christ at the parish church, but they maybe or maybe not did not even believe in it at home. They had confession. They went to confession at the church, but if they didn't believe that the church was valid, that their priest was valid, because they were Donatistic, don't forget, they would have confession in secret among themselves. So you have that as well. And so basically, they were spread everywhere. It doesn't mean that they were a majority of the population. In some villages, they were the majority, but it doesn't mean in any country or in any city or in any province they were really a majority. They were really small for sure, but they were there. That's the point. So when they did that, the goal wasn't uh, to make new members. Once they were persecuted and once they knew that the target was on their back, they just hunkered down, and their goal was to stick together, stay united, and be hidden. That was their goal. They wanted to hide. They wanted to survive, because otherwise they would have been taken out, obviously, by the Inquisition. They could have been burned, which I think some people like to, on the Catholic side, they like to say, oh, the Inquisition didn't do any of that. It did. The Inquisition, I mean, the secular powers were involved and really the ones who were even allowed to do this, but the Inquisition definitely handed people over. The Third Lateran Council, or was it the Council of Reims? I forget which one, said that heretics can be burned. I'll talk about that in the Cathar episode. That's a bit more pertinent there. But the goal was to keep the faith hidden and among themselves. And you can even see this when you look at their last names and you look at the names of the people who are being interviewed in the Inquisition. They all have similar names. I think you can even see this today in certain communities in Europe and southern Italy where they were, in the Alps in some places. You can see where they were for the longest time. So they were living in a state of constant fear here, but they were that unifies people, right? I mean, look at the first Christians. They believed the same thing. They were they were persecuted, they were hunted, but they were still doing it for God, and that gave them a sense of purpose, a sense of unity, and a sense of where they were going with themselves. The only source we actually have of the Poor of Lyon at this point, from really after 1200, is one letter from the Lombard brothers to the letter to the Austrian brothers. They call themselves brothers, by the way. That's just what they, even today you might hear that in some Protestant groups. I don't know if it comes from here or not, but they might say brother so and so. That's how they call themselves. And I'll talk about names in a second. Actually, that's important. As for names, they call themselves brothers, Poor of Lyon and Poor of Christ. The Waldensian name was sort of a pejorative for them. They didn't actually call themselves that. And that word Vaudois, was a synonym for a sorcerer for later on. And it happened a few times with words in the medieval era. For example, in French, modern French, you have the word bougre, which is Bulgar, which is where the Cathars heresy came from. Well, it didn't come from there, I don't think, but as long as they were concerned, it came from there. So they're calling, oh, you Bulgarian, something like that. At least that could be a modern myth. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I have to look into that. It's my bad. But, so there is always a will in the medieval era to equate heresy with sorcery. And that's what happens in these French-speaking lands. In 1326, Pope John the 22nd qualified it as a heresy because of its Sabbath rites and satanic rituals, which were religious in nature. So, I mean, were they actually having Sabbath rites? And I think that means, like, satanic. It doesn't mean, like, Sabbath worship. It just means, like, they were being satanic. Were they? There were the accusations there. I'm not sure if Pope John the 22nd knew, or if he could have been playing on some sensation. He could have been just saying that. The interesting thing is, from 1459 to 1461, there were 15 people burned at the stake for votary in Arras. And what does that mean? Is that votary? Is that for being Vaudois, or is that for being sorcerers? It's hard to say. And sort of a fun fact, you have at this period the first depiction of witches flying on brooms, that sort of thing. That comes from here. So it must have been some kind of Flemish origin story or folklore type thing that we finally have records of in the 1400s. It's we have a book called Champion des Dames, or Champion of the Ladies, by Lefranc, and it has the first depiction we have, you can look it up, of witches flying on brooms. And there's a book from 1450, which could be after this one, called Errors of Cathars, or Those Who Ride on Brooms or Rods. So we have Cathars being equated with sorcery, with being witches, and Vaudois, Waldensian, is being applied to that term, which can conflate the two in people's minds. Maybe it already was, maybe it wasn't. It probably was. There was a sermon by Le Broussard on May 9th of 1460 in Arras, who said that the Vaudois put ointment on their sticks and put it between their legs and they vanished. So, is he talking about the Waldensians? Is he talking about heretics? Is he talking about sorcerers? It's hard to say. There's another record. Jean Sanctor wrote the Traité de Vaudry in 1460, so a bit after these two previous things, which said that Vaudry was worse than heresy, Islam, or any pagan religion. So you have a bit of a mix of belief there. What they were talking about, they were probably talking about sorcery. The people who were condemned and burned at the stake in Arras were probably just people convicted of sorcery. Could they have been Vaudois? It's possible. Or in Vaudois, I mean Poor of Lyon. Could they have been? Maybe. We don't really know because we just don't have the records, and that's all we're left with. It's kind of scanty. In terms of more names, in Savoy, another place where the Waldensians, the Port of Lyon, obviously were, the word Vaudes was called, it meant sodomite. They were called sodomites, which is actually similar to bougre, like I already mentioned in France for the Bulgarians. So you have, there's a whole mix of words like this, like sodomite, sorcerer, heretic, Bulgarian, bougre, Vaudes, Vaudois. They all kind of mix together. It might be a bit hard to unravel all of this, being 600 years in the future. But if anyone's ever done it, it'd be great to know. Until then, I guess we move on. And to talk more about what they believe themselves to be, we can mention here what I was talking about in episode 1 about propaganda back then, and how they believed that they were descendants of the apostles. And around the 1300s, they started to say that they were descended from Sylvester the First. They didn't believe that at first, obviously. There's no evidence of, say, uh, Vaudet saying, "Oh yeah, this is a sect that's been around for a long time. I'm just becoming a part of it." That never happened. He started it. So, but they would say that they were descended from the time. So if you look even at Adventists today, they tend to believe this too. They believe the same thing, and so do Baptists. Anyone who says that, say, the Pope is the Antichrist, those tend to believe in this story that there was a true church in the beginning for the first 300-ish years, and then as soon as Constantine comes in and him, Pope Sylvester the First, they make this whole new church that didn't exist before, and they persecute the true Christians and send them fleeing into the mountains and all this stuff. They started to have that as sort of an origin story for themselves at this point, and that's when they gave Vaudet the name Peter. That's why we call him Peter Waldo today, because of the fact that they were, because St. Peter, the first pope, they gave Peter the name to that guy. So he could have had that name. It could have just been an oral tradition that was just kind of known until it was finally recorded at some point, but we don't know, and it does coincide pretty well with this mythical story, you could say, that they would begin later on. As for their beliefs, only the preachers were to be the actual ones going. So not everybody at this point was going to be a preacher anymore. It used to be, and that was the whole goal, was that everybody in the sect would go out and preach. Everyone. Now, it's only a few. Now it's only a small amount of people. This eventually turns into a hierarchy, which will last for some time until it eventually disappears again. But for now, only a few people are charged with preaching, because I guess it's dangerous, and also because the working party, at least in, say party, the working group, say in France, eventually won out, and so you had people who, they need to live. They had whole towns that were, you can't have a whole town of just preachers. They had to actually feed themselves. So they eventually had to kind of work their way into the world a little bit, and that happened a lot. If you look at, for example, when they would go under oath, sometimes eventually they would start taking oaths. Not for a while, but they would start to. And that was one of the things that gave them away instantly. Because at the beginning of an inquisitorial trial, they were to be told, okay, take an oath that you won't say anything wrong, and they would refuse. And if someone refused to take an oath, he was pretty much a Poor of Lyon. Pretty easily to spot them. They believed in confession still. They believed in the absolution of sins, but outside of the church hierarchy. The letters I mentioned before from the Italian brothers to the Austrian brothers, where they called it a half sacrament. So they kind of believed in the church's absolution, kind of didn't. It's sort of strange there. Some might have, some might have not. But for the most part, they did believe in confession. And changing with their views on the Eucharist, some believed in it, some didn't. And like I said before, I think the whole fish thing kind of died out at a certain point, and they just had the body and blood. And there would have been some people who still supported the church to a degree. This eventually obviously died out, and by the 1500s, it's safe to say probably none of the Poor of Lyon actually did, like the paper, because at that point their propaganda had kind of spread. I don't like using the word propaganda that much, but I think it fits for the most part. Their origin story had sort of been spread enough probably by then to for them all to realize or to know that the church is this evil monster that's trying to kill them and did from the first centuries. But for a time they probably were completely okay with it to some degree, and they would have just fizzled out over the centuries. And also by the mid to late 1300s, they finally began to reject the veneration of saints, which was a thing that they did for a long. Again, they were Catholics, so they were going to venerate the saints, but eventually this started to kind of fall out of favor among them. And like I said before, the Waldensians did have double lives. So they would try everything that they believed was really just an ideal, or it was just in theory, because they never always had opportunities to prove these things. Like say about the death penalty, they never actually really had a way to prove that they were anti-death penalty because they were never in a position to give it or deny it in the first place. Some things like denying oaths they might have done, but the point is that a lot of times there were double lives, and that was the case for them in pretty much their whole history after they were sent underground after 1230. They still had to externally be Catholic, and they had to say revere the saints. They had to observe feast days, Sundays. Uh, so there were some cases where they might have been Sabbath observers, but they still would have had to work on Sunday if they could and seek. I think they did that in secret sometimes. They'd work in secret on Sundays if they could, and they would observe on Saturdays. But that's not that many of them. We don't really have much evidence to prove that. They didn't believe in paying the tithe to unworthy priests, but sometimes they did, so they can make them harder to find. And the saints, they could do lip service to them and stay hidden. That's kind of what they did. They would maybe, if they had to go by a statue, maybe they would bow or something just to sort of take the target off their backs to prove that they were not sketchy in the eyes of the church itself. And they believed in purgatory at least until like the 1300s. Eventually, they stopped believing in purgatory, though. And they did also believe in post-mortem prayers, like I said before. They did pray for the souls of the dead. This was a thing to come that would concern them around the time of the Reformation, where they would send one of theirs to the reformers, and I forget who it was exactly. I'll get there in another episode. And they asked him, can we cry for the dead? So there's some things that they had kind of a dissonance in some ways about the dead. Um, some did believe in invocation and relics of the saints, and they would even do so. They would leave things in their wills, for example, that would you wouldn't do that if you didn't believe, unless they were just trying to hide it. It's possible too. And after a certain time, they gave up the whole oaths thing, where they wouldn't say oaths. They did it now for marriages, for deals. They would do homage. They would give oaths. Something that the author of Waldensian Descent did was he uh, looked at the wills of Provence in that time. So all the wills in certain areas were written by notaries, and the notary would help the soon to die write down what would happen with his money. And one of those things was masses. And we find that 80% of the Poor of Lyon had masses said for them after their death. So they had to have had some kind of belief that it had an effect, or they were doing this completely just to hide themselves. Which, I mean, if they're gonna die, so be it. What's the point of having it in their will? This is a bit strange. For example, they could have a novena of masses said for them. They could have one mass said for them. They could have one said at the 1 year anniversary of their death. But once it got to an excessive amount, sometimes there were 30 masses said for the deceased soul. Only 8% of the Poor of Lyon did that versus 71% of Catholics. And for perpetual mass until the money that they gave ran out was 0.5% of the Poor of Lyon to 24% of Catholics. So they obviously went down as time went on, probably for financial purposes. Maybe only the rich could afford these, and the Poor of Lyon might not have been as rich or with it as the Catholics were. So they might have had some kind of skepticism there, or it could have been a financial reason, but they still overwhelmingly, with 80%, had masses said for them after that. And not even 100% of Catholics did, probably. They might not have had wills. Someone could have had. The point is that their stance on purgatory, even if it was changing over time and it was eventually going away over the 1200s, 1300s, they still believed in efficacious masses said for their souls. In the famous Morel and Masson report, which I'll talk about in a later episode, though, they did say that it was members of the Antichrist who were giving the sacraments to the people. So that could be a 1500s opinion, but it could be something that was held and continued, perpetuated from the earlier times to them. So they might have been taking part in these sacraments, baptism. They were still part of parish church life. They weren't just hiding in caves, but they might have been doing it completely just, against their will, I guess, or just to save their hides. Funny enough, in their wills, though, the Poor of Lyon did give more money than the Catholics at 36% versus 20% to the poor in their town. This is all, by the way, in the town of Liberon, which I'm not really sure where that is in Provence, but it's in Provence, which is kind of the heartland of the Poor of Lyon, or Waldensianism. And one of the things that would kind of give them away, in addition to not saying oaths, for a while, because eventually they would start to say oaths to save themselves. One thing that would give them away was that if they were told to recite the Ave Maria, they couldn't. Ave Maria, plena de gratia. And then once they keep on going, they would eventually it would turn into this sort of bastardized Latin Germanic mixture. It would be totally wrong, and usually if that happened, because people who were Catholic back then, they wouldn't have spoken Latin, but they still would have probably known the prayers fairly well. And that's something that the Waldensians, the Poor of Lyon, were actually extremely ritualistic about, was saying the Our Father. They believed they had to pray before meals, all the time, and that actually scared the reformers. I'll talk about that later, but they were very ritualistic too. They just didn't really know all the prayers, so, or maybe at least in Latin, maybe they knew them in their vernacular only, like the Our Father. So that would give them away. When they couldn't say the Ave Maria, they would just mess up. Something else that changed was that women could no longer preach the word of God, according to one interrogation. And so as time went on, the movement itself began to split by geographical terms and by linguistic terms. So they had a Romance-speaking division and a Germanic-speaking division. So these people would tend to talk with each other more. They would have more of the same, some more similar beliefs, some more culture, and there wouldn't have been very much communication across that. So at this point, there are kind of two different groups. We have a lot more documentation of the Romance speaking because they had a lot more records, and they're the ones who really survived into the Reformation more. The ones in the East either became Hussites, well, Taborites, or they just fizzled out really over time. And in the Germanic lands, they called their masters lords. These are the preachers because they only had certain people preaching, like I said before, at this point. Because of persecution, they couldn't have everybody preaching, so only some people would be delegated to go do so, or would volunteer to go do so. It was a lot more structured, as far as we know, in the Romance-speaking areas, which I'll mention. We don't really know much about the Germanic-speaking customs because there's not much of a record there. We only really just have the inquisitorial stuff. They would call their masters lords, the ones who would go and preach. In Piedmont, these were called magistri, but there are also other names. They were called barbus, which was the word for uncle in the Piedmont dialect, which I think might still have a modern connotation too. But it was a title of respect given to elders, uncles, that sort of thing. If there's a sense that the Poor of Lyon were very egalitarian and were sort of opposed to the hierarchized Catholic Church and society as a whole, that isn't true. society as a whole was really hierarchized all through time, really. And we know this because in the Confession of Raymond of Costa from August 1319 to April 1320, he said that they had a majoral who would make priests and deacons. This wasn't something that was there from the very beginning because, again, the Poor of Lyon thought that they thought of themselves within the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. But once they were excommunicated and once they had sort of set up their settlements, their beliefs, they started to make a hierarchy. And it didn't last very long. Maybe by the 1400s, it was already fizzling out. And by the 1500s, there doesn't seem to have been a hierarchy at all. And by that, I mean a hierarchy that has, uh, like Raymond of Costas has a majoral, deacons, priests. They only had just the Barbus and they had the believers, which is something that Bernard Guy said resembled the Cathars, which probably isn't true. They probably didn't gain that inspiration from the Cathars, but it was just a neat thing that he had pointed out in his inquisitorial report. By 1530, the Poor of Lyon were making vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty, so they were kind of ascetic in a way now, and they were not allowed to marry, and they had all things in common between themselves. They would also have meetings every year in the Alps, where they would meet with all the other Barbus. They would be sent on missions. They would hear maybe complaints against them if there were any. Justice would be done to them if they were accused of a crime. And if they were, they could be taken, the status could be taken from them without any hope of return. The meetings themselves were held in Piedmont in August. They would change location every year. Sometimes it would be in the same place. Sometimes it would change. Sometimes it was in Provence as well. There they would all gather, and four governors did most of the authoritative decisions. So there was hierarchy within the Barbus. There were four of these governors who had a higher place than the rest of them. Maybe they were seniors. They would talk about the news from. Don't forget, these people were all over Europe, so they would come back and they would be able to give news of, say, the sentiment towards them in some places, maybe just general news and what was going on at the time in all these places, wars, famines, good things, bad things. They were to allocate funds, and all members were to forgive each other's sins. Also, at the meeting, new missions would be given to each of the Barbus. They would always be sent in pairs to imitate the sending out of the disciples in the New Testament. They would not be sent to the place they had already been, so as not to build up their interest in any area. So they'd always have to meet new people, and they couldn't get comfortable anywhere, which made it weirder maybe for the people who were being served by them because they always had somebody new to showing up every year. But it helped keep the mission fresh. Maybe it helped keep secrecy because the people you couldn't have these people just showing up and then leaving and coming back and leaving. They could have aroused suspicion, so they made sure that they went to different places. And how one became a barba, the process went like this. So a few men would propose themselves to the barbas to become them, and they would choose a few. Not all of them were chosen, only the ones with the best standing. During the winter months, they would be trained to read and write. Mostly, they would learn Matthew and John. They were trying to memorize these. They'd memorize a lot of scripture, but Matthew and John were some of their focuses, among other things. And the rest of the year, they would accompany their senior barba assigned to them. This was for 3 to 4 years until they had a ceremony where they had the Eucharist, and then they had the laying on of hands, which Morel calls ministry of the presbyterate and of preaching. And then they would have their names changed in line with scriptural importance, which also helped their secrecy. In scripture, there's a lot of name changing, which I think most people who are religious will understand that changing the name has a power to religious means, and that was something that they had to do. It helped with secrecy, of course, but it also damages our understanding of them because we don't have the right name. So we might have a name of a barba, but we don't know who he is, and other than that, his name is In other words, there could be two different people that could be the same person that we don't really know. So it doesn't really help, and maybe they would just be the Barbara John or something, and we have no idea who this is. But it could be someone that we do know elsewhere, we just don't know. The fact that they had schooling is pretty important. They wasn't university education by any means, which was definitely more efficacious for. I mean, if you read the records, you have the Dominicans and the Franciscans who are way more educated on scripture, way more educated on church tradition, and these guys who can also read and write and might memorize the Gospels and a couple other books. They definitely weren't there. They weren't on the same caliber, and this is to be expected. I mean, this is also the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, so this is when the church was using educative apparatuses to deter heresy. I mean, the Franciscans and Dominicans were used as the weapons to fight against heretics, and they were some of the most educated people in the world. So it's sort of disingenuous to say that the Poor of Lyon were just ignorant. They definitely had education, and they saw the value in education, but of course this was only for a very small amount of the population of their sect. Only the Barbas had this. Once they were out in the field, the Barbas, they were in pairs, as you know, so they had one who would know the locations of houses in general, and there was another one who would know which families were going to be receptive to them. This was the case mostly in the Romance-speaking regions. We don't really know their methods in the Germanic ones, but they were probably different. In those places, once they were welcomed into the houses, they might have had some kind of signs to identify themselves, to make sure that they were secretive. There's some legend about it being their shoes, or having a sign on their shoes, hence the Sabbatarian name. I don't think there's any proof for that though. They would go to these houses. There might have been somebody keeping watch to see if anybody would come in and ask what they were doing. They would talk about the Bible. Usually, what would happen is the Barba would speak from Scripture first. They would maybe cite Scripture. Then they would talk about it. They also carried around with them small books, and these books are interesting choices. Some of them are actually church fathers, among other things. They would also hear confessions from the people they were visiting, and they would give penances for their confessions. The Poor of Lyon were very ritualistic, just like Catholics are, in the sense that they would have confession, they would have penance, and that penance would be efficacious for salvation. It was usually saying the Pater Noster, the Our Father, a lot of times, and that was something that kind of scared the Protestants, which I'll get to later. After each confession, the Barbas would receive an alms from the penitent, and that was to help keep their mission going so that they could actually live and afford to eat. The confession was also important because it was how somebody entered their sect. At the age of 12 to 15, a boy or girl would have their first confession, and that would be what actually brought them into the Poor of Lyon. By the books that we have that were in the possession of the Poor of Lyon, that were found by the Inquisition, they usually liked the four Gospels, especially, like I said, Matthew and John. They liked St. Paul's letters, and they also really liked stories about suffering and perseverance, like the Maccabees, Tobit, and Job, because they saw themselves sort of as them in a way, because they were a minority being persecuted and trying to serve God. They also liked the books of wisdom, Psalms, and Proverbs. And they really liked the four doctors Ambrose, Augustine, Gregory, and Jerome. And they also have some original works that they wrote, but we don't have really anything about those because they've been lost to time. In scripture itself, you can see that they did not subscribe to some reduced canon like Protestants do, especially the ones that claim the Poor of Lyon. In order to keep themselves under disguise, the Barbas would usually try to pick up a job, or they'd try to pick up the appearance of having a job. This was normally needlework, medicine, and surgery, and they always had the tools for these jobs with them, which kind of gave them away because if they were seen, or if their belongings were searched and they had these, because they already were suspicious anyways, it was a pretty good indicator that they were a Poor of Lyon. I disagree with Odiseo in his book, who says that since they didn't have appeal to saints, they took to healing themselves, and that's why they were involved in surgery and medicine. I don't like that because I think that there was enough medicine in the Catholic world as well that It doesn't really make sense to make that claim, but I can see where it's coming from. One such person who was found with a needle kit like this was Pierre, who had his belongings in his house searched, and he was condemned to death because at this time, especially in the 1500s, but probably earlier, if you were a heresiarch or a teacher of heresy, you'd be killed. King Francis I of France, though, stopped this from happening because he interrupted the Inquisition trials, and he seems to have lived as late as 1548, where he appears in a trial record. Overall, though, King Francis still made sure that the Poor of Lyon were a prime target, especially in Provence, where he was trying to expand his realm. And lastly, for this video, I'd like to talk about how Donatism held the Poor of Lyon together for so many centuries. So they, the believers called their Barba, they called them good men, and they believed that they were really good men overall, uh, especially because the clergy at the time in the Catholic Church had kind of an ill repute. The Archbishop of Turin in 1520 said that the unworthiness of the clergy was one of the reasons for the Waldensian success. So even some clergy admitted that the Catholic clergy could be rough. And we know this, right? We know, for example, in the 1200s in Paris, there were at the university some of the masters who were even clerics. They would go out in the streets and not wear helmets or headgear or anything because they just wear their tonsors because obviously hitting a priest comes with a very bad punishment for them. And they would, go wreak havoc with the students, that kind of thing. Not all priests obviously were bad. Can't stress that enough. But there definitely was a sense of look over there at that parish priest. Look at how he's living. Look at how our Barba is. Look how much better he is. There were in Stettin, in Germany, in the east, there were interrogations where the locals they would they had folkloric beliefs still. All of Europe pretty much did, but it was more strongly felt there. They had at least beliefs or legends, rumors that the Barba had actually gone to the gates of heaven to hear the preaching of God and to come back through a dangerous journey to share what they had heard. Odysseus states in his book that it evokes the ritual progression of shamanic initiation in traditional stages, a traumatizing experience that the shaman manages to overcome, followed by the revelation of his supernatural powers. And that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this rant about what the Poor of Lyon were doing, what they believed, beyond sort of the surface level YouTube type of thing, a bit deeper into their story. So goodbye, and stay tuned for the next episode. That'll be about the end of the Czech Poor of Lyon and the Hussite movement.